Welcome to emoLab's Talk Series podcast, where we explore how technology shapes our lives. From digital consumers to gig workers and service robots, we delve into the world of algorithms, AI, and automation, examining how they transform our emotions, behaviors, and businesses. In each episode, we bring you thought-provoking conversations on the impacts of algorithmic capitalism and how to navigate a future increasingly dominated by machines. Join us for insights into who benefits, who's left out, and what it all means for the future. On today's episode of the emoLab Talk Series, we present Dr. Jonathan Martineau, Assistant Professor at Concordia University and Director at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Time, Technology, and Capitalism, all the way from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Today, he will explore the pivotal economic, political, and cultural forces shaping today's AI movement, marked by rapid innovation and the deployment of AI and algorithmic technologies across society. Through a comprehensive and critical lens, he examines AI as a symptom of a broader historical shift in capitalism, the rise of algorithmic capital.
Thanks to the Toronto Metropolitan University. Special thanks to the emoLab, to Mathieu Lagente for this great invitation and organizing this talk. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to be present to share my recent work. And I'm looking forward to discussing afterwards as well, AI and critical theory with everyone. So I will be presenting here some of the findings and general approach, if you will, of my latest book. This is a book co-author with my colleague Jonathan Durand-Folco from St. Paul University in Ottawa. And the book has been published in French last fall by Éco-Société here in Montreal. So that's the book. So you don't see, I have a copy here. It's a thick 500 pages a piece of work, and it's the sum, if you will, of a multidisciplinary research project that began with a common interest, really, that my co-author Jonathan Durand-Folco and I had for a study of contemporary technological transformations. We were both, as social scientists, but as philosophers as well, we were interrogated particularly by the speed of technological innovations today, and how the world had changed in just a mere 20 years. How digital and later algorithmic technologies had come in such a short period of time to be integrated in our lives in a very profound way, actually, in terms of what we do, how we do it, our everyday lives, our work, how we relate to other people, institutions, how we socialize, and so on. So it seemed to us that this rapid, accelerated development of algorithmic technologies, and they're mediating more and more of our relationships, of our transaction and activities, it might also be related to broader socioeconomic and political transformations that we witnessed in the last 15, 20 years, and that have been manifested in different economic, political, cultural dynamics as well, all unfolding in a kind of pell-mell way, right? So, for example, you have a shift in economic power from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, the rise of tech multi-billionaires, a polarization and extremism in politics as well, rising geopolitical tensions, notably between China and the US, the rise of digital labor, entrenchment of certain systemic inequalities, explosion of the use of social media, fake news, online hate, chatbots, then crypto, conflicts and violence around mining of coltan and lithium, remote work, Gen AI last year, etc. I could go on, right? So we started to ask ourselves, is there a common thread that runs through and connects these developments together? And we started to doubt that this was just mere technological change. And we started to try to see all of these transformations as symptoms of something deeper, if you will, a more profound socially or even historical transformation. So our research project aims at understanding in an integrated framework this vast social and historical transformation that we see manifested in the accelerated dissemination of algorithmic tech in society, for example, in that vast digital infrastructure that now underpins much of our lives and institutions, and more recently, the rise of AI. So our first assumption in this project rapidly became that we cannot understand the current technological revolution without also understanding the recent changes in the very functioning of capitalism. And conversely, we cannot understand contemporary capitalism without understanding algorithmic technologies and AI today. So our theoretical goal in the book is to forge this critical theory of AI and algorithmic technology, which is at the same time actually a critical theory of contemporary capitalism. So these two for us go together very much. So these are loaded concepts, of course, critical theory, capitalism. Our work here is situated in a long tradition of critical theory and critical theories that and studies of capitalism as well, studies in heterodox political economy that go back to thinkers like Marx, like Horkheimer and Adorno, like Rosa Luxemburg, more recently like Shoshana Zuboff, for example. And critical theories come in many forms. There are many different types of feminism, for example, anti-racist critical race theory, for example, decolonial approaches, Frankfurt School, Marxism, and others. These approaches, these critical approaches, share a commitment to analyzing society from a holistic perspective. They share a commitment to historicizing social phenomena as well. They share a commitment in clarifying power relations. And most notably, I think, in my view, they all share a commitment, a normative commitment to emancipation of oppressed groups, to social justice in general as well. So that's one first loaded concept, critical theory, if you will. There's another perhaps loaded concept that figures centrally in our research, and it's the concept of capitalism. And here, our main inspiration in the use of that concept of capitalism comes from a Marxist feminist theoretical framework developed by Nancy Fraser, the great scholar Nancy Fraser, in recent years. So, for Fraser, interestingly, capitalism is not just an economic system. It's not just a way to organize production and distribution. It is more than that. She rather sees capitalism as what she calls an institutionalized social order. So this order then comprises different dimensions. It is obviously and importantly an economic system of production and distribution. Of course, capitalism refers to a sort or a type of economic organization, but it is a broader social system as well. It is directly connected to the political sphere and to the state. It's also directly related to social reproduction, forms of paid and unpaid domestic, affective, and care work in society. It is also directly related to nature as well. And this critical understanding is really key for us in studying AI and algorithmic technologies, since it allows us to inquire into all of these different ramifications of technological production and spheres of application of AI as well. So in other words, in our book, we try to treat AI not just as a technology, but as a broader social phenomenon with relations to economic production, distribution, but also politics, information, culture, personal relations, labor, leisure, nature, etc. So this informs then our concepts of algorithmic capital, if you will. And I want to flesh it out a little bit more here. So what is algorithmic capital? Algorithmic capital is a polysemic concept in our work. It has many layers of meaning, and it does so because it seeks to grasp a multifaceted and complex phenomenon. So for us, algorithmic capital is an economic logic of valorization and accumulation. It's also a new form of social power. It's also a form of mediation of social relations. It's also a form of relation to nature in the form of an extractive industry. So let's unpack this a little bit, the many layers in our concept of algorithmic capital, if you will. First off, a new logic of accumulation. For us, algorithmic capital builds on more quote unquote traditional forms of valorization and accumulation in the capitalist system, like private property of capital, production of commodities for exchange by a waged labor force, expropriation of resources to create economic assets, etc. However, in recent years, there's a new mechanism of data extraction and valorization that comes and mixes with, in complex configurations, this relationship between human productive activities and the accumulation of capital. So algorithmic capital rests on the exploitation of wage labor from a critical theory perspective, but it also rests on extraction and valorization of data that is produced during paid labor time, but also outside of it. For example, by platform users or use of connected objects and apps. So during leisure time, domestic chore time, everyday life, even sleep, right? So Shoshana Zuboff, for those of you familiar with her work, she has elucidated much of the mechanisms, if you will, of this new form of valorization built on data extraction. And the pioneer here is Google, extracting data from user interaction with its search engine at first, transforming that user-generated data into what Zuboff calls predictive products that are sold to advertisers. So that is seen as the first iteration of that model, if you will. Without getting too much into details or jargon here, we can simply mention that the deployment of data extractive technologies that datafy human behavior, that turn social natural events and processes, times and places into data, this provides a new raw material in the form of data, which can become an asset for firms in multiple ways. Data that is stored, cleaned, can be used to train algorithms to produce AI tech, to produce predictive products, as Zuboff calls them, or simply attract investments as well from venture capitalists and others. In this sense, data can become a commodity. So data-based products can be bought and sold on markets, but it can also become capital for a firm in the sense of algorithms and or a data asset, what is called a data asset in the literature. For example, Uber is a good example. It can serve as a very fine example of that new logic of accumulation at work. Uber is one of the biggest capitalist enterprises in the world. Number 127 on Fortune 500 last time I checked. So you would expect a company like Uber to be turning a profit. But Uber has had only one profitable year in the last 8. Uber entered Fortune 500 in 2020, but after losing $8.5 billion in 2019. Right? But Uber has reached a level of algorithmic accumulation in the form of algorithms, in the form of data assets, that is such that in one meeting with Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Uber CEO could secure a $3.5 billion investment from Saudi funds. So Uber's algorithms, its accumulated data, are part of its capital in that. And in this example, it attracts important investments, even if it doesn't turn out a profit in the classical capitalist sense. Now, with the rise of this mode of extraction and valorization comes a vast process of production and commerce of algorithmic technologies. And we're right in the middle of it in our view. And this leads to automation of more and more social processes, productive activities, but also decision makings, administrations, and today automation even of communications with Gen AI, for example. So this process is, of course, unequal, It depends on each sector's needs, their configurations, their level of resistance as well. But all in all, we can see here a new form taken on by capital accumulation, what we call in the book a new regime of accumulation or a new stage of capitalism, where these new forms of valorization interact in complex ways with more traditional or classical features of capitalist production and distribution. That's the first aspect of our concept of algorithmic capital. The second aspect is that we see it as a mode of social relations. In a nutshell, since this change in forms of valorization and accumulation is tied to specific technologies, we also see new forms of technological mediation of social relations that become prominent. Our relations to other people, institutions, culture are increasingly mediated by algorithmic technologies. So we think of social media, digital citizenship, access to information, access to collective memory as well, right? Pretty much mediated through Google's search engine by now, right? But access to cultural goods as well. So it's a modality of social relations as well, right? Between people and between people in their world, if you will. A third aspect of algorithmic capital for us, in our view, is that it's also a form of power. And I might not have enough time today to develop much on this, but in a nutshell, we argue in the book that algorithmic power entrenches existing systems of oppression, such as racism, such as patriarchy, most notably by automating the biases and discriminatory practices found in data sets that train algorithms. So there's a kind of automation of oppression here at the level of power, but it also creates new forms of power, new forms of domination and discrimination as well, including a concentration of socioeconomic power in a few giant tech companies, which also levy important lobbying power, mind you. It creates new power dynamics as well based on different levels of tech literacy in the population. It consolidates powers of surveillance by firms, by governments, by other individuals as well. And finally, it gives rise to a new form of what critical scholars such as Antoinette de Rouvroy or Karen Young have called algorithmic governmentality, which is a power to direct, orient, nudge behaviors using access and control over information environments as well. So at the level of social power, there's an entrenchment of existing forms of power, but there are also new forms of power that develop with the rise of algorithmic capitalism. Finally, last layer of meaning is that we also see algorithmic capital as a form of relation between society and nature that takes the modality of an extractive industry, as Kate Crawford has called it. I'll come back to that a little bit later, if you allow me. So by examining these different aspects of the current institutionalized social order of capitalism, we argue in the book that we have reached a new stage in capitalist development, a new type of capitalist society that builds on older forms of capitalism, that branches off in particular from the previous stage of neoliberal capitalism, but that supersedes it under this new powerful logic of algorithmic capital. So this passage, this transition, if you will, is not a clear-cut rupture. No historical transition is ever a clear-cut rupture. Many aspects of neoliberalism endure, but there is, in our view, an unmistakable transition in the last 15, 20 years, which occurred in a specific historical conjuncture as well. So the conjuncture and some elements of it, the first element of this transition, first, the historical decade of neoliberalism leading to the crisis of 2007, 2008. that severely weakens the neoliberal model of accumulation. And, neoliberalism, from an heterodox political economy perspective, has never been super efficient or performing well as a regime of accumulation when you compare it to other periods in the history of capitalism, notably the post-war period, for example. So in terms of growth, neoliberalism does not do very well. Neoliberalism worked really well, however, in redistributing productivity gains in the economy towards the 1% and keeping real wages for working population stagnant at best. But neoliberalism itself, as a regime of accumulation, was notably unstable, especially in the financial sphere. In any case, and it was, according to our analysis, it was on life support since at least the mid 1990s and kept going only as a debt economy, really, with crippling contradictions all the way to the global crisis of 2008. That's the first element of conjuncture, right? A second element is a techno-scientific revolution in AI and algorithmic technologies from the 1990s, 2000s as well. And here we refer to machine learning, deep learning, and these techno-scientific innovations. In a nutshell, here you create the possibility of automating processes in algorithmic tech. And this is a game changer as well, in our view, a very important element of the conjuncture of this transition. A third element I can mention of the conjuncture is that new business model of extraction and valorization of data, which I just discussed earlier, right? So we see what has been called the austerity decades after 2008 as actually a transition period, with a reorientation of investment fluxes towards the tech sector, rapid growth of the GAFAMs, and a rapid growth and development of the tech startup ecosystems as well, and not just in the States, but all across the board. We see as well a change in that decade post-2008. We see a change at the top of the capitalist hierarchy, with tech firms reaching the top in terms of profitability, in terms of market capitalization as well. So there's a new engine of capitalist growth. If you compare the top 10 companies in market capitalization, for example, in 2006, you'll see a lot of financial companies, some extractive companies. If you look at the same top 10 in 2019, for example, just before the pandemics, it's mostly GAFAMs and their Chinese counterparts of Baidu, Tencent, and so on that have raised so many ladders in that regard. So we see that as a new engine, if you will, of capitalist growth that very importantly will start to colonize at the same time other sectors of the economy, such as that we can hardly find today's sectors which are not taken over and reconfigured by big data and algorithms. Finance was actually a pioneer in algorithmizing its activities, if we think of fintech, for example. So this was already going on, but now industrial production, media, advertising, of course, but mining as well, right? The smart mine model, right? Of data extraction, automation of mining, energy sector, agriculture now. And we have a vice minister here in Quebec, Minister for Agriculture yesterday, who declared that the main form of valorization for agriculture now is data extraction, right? Retail as well. All of these sectors integrate extraction and valorization of data and automation in their activities. Okay. So algorithmic capital consolidates, but then it colonizes the other forms of economic activities. Then at the end of that austerity decade, COVID happens. And COVID for us consolidates the passage to the era of algorithmic capital, notably by forcing the transfer of a whole host of activities online during the confinement periods. And as such, it's creating new norms for social activity, for work, remote work, and so on and so forth. So consolidating these new practices, normalizing them. So you take on the one hand our claim that our new configuration of capitalism has developed under our very eyes in the last 20 years. On the other end, you consider how we view capitalism not just as an organization of the economy, but as an institutionalized social order. And if you put these two ideas together, you see immediately that our inquiry will be taken into different spheres and sectors of social life to inquire into the changes brought about by this new historical configuration. So the book itself is an inquiry, if you will, into this new world of algorithmic capital as it is developing in an accelerated manner in a bunch of different social spheres and social sectors. Um, just a brief overview, if you will, of some of our thesis in the book. And after that brief overview, I will complete the presentation by focusing a bit more on the topic of labor. Okay. So in terms of overview, some themes that we look at in that exploration of the institutionalized social order and the changes brought about algorithmic capital. The book itself is divided in 20 chapters, and each chapter is organized and titled as a straightforward thesis. We begin with the usual academic, theoretical, methodological discussions in the first two chapters. But then we explore the transformation of time and temporality in algorithmic capitalism. We argue that algorithms accelerate labor time, but they also degrade leisure time. It connects more and more of our lived times to market operations of production, extraction, consumption. So it imposes temporal pressures on experience in a way that, in our view, is quite novel in the history of capitalism. We then go on to the topic of labor and social reproduction. We engage with debates on automation. We dedicate a full chapter to social reproduction and domestic labor. I'll bracket labor for now, and I'll develop these ideas in more depth in just a minute. We also have then two chapters that historicize this transition I was just evoking from neoliberal to algorithmic capitalism. And we theorize, if you will, this new logic of accumulation of capital, which I've just presented in broad outlines here. A quite substantial section of the book deals with politics, power, the state, and international relations as well. And we explore how algorithmic capital entrenches existing forms of power and configures new ones. We also explore the rapid dissemination of algorithmic technologies in state administration, in the judicial system, for example. But also we look at repercussions in international relations, notably tensions between the US and China over high-tech and AI. But also we look at a new international division of digital labor, novel forms of what we call data colonialism that configure new relations between algorithmic powers such as the US and China and the global South. So there are international politics reconfigurations as well linked with the transition to algorithmic capital. We have three chapters that follow in which we analyze ideological cultural forms that accompany the development of algorithmic capital in our period. We examine powerful new ideologies that percolate from a strange partnership between Oxford philosophers and tech billionaires. Maybe you've heard of ideas such as long-termism, effective altruism, transhumanism. So we look at these more esoteric ideologies, but we also look at more popular versions of Californian or Silicon Valley ideology of connectivity, technological solutionism, market libertarianism, new forms of, right? So we also explore new forms of subjectivities that are created by extraction and online socialization. We try to analyze these tensions that arise between forms of connected cells and forms of alienation as well, forms of isolation, dispossession that come with the use of algorithmic technologies. We engaged in with the environmental articulations of this new institutionalized order of capitalism. And this is probably a chapter I personally learned the most while researching. And as I mentioned earlier, we see algorithmic capital as producing an extractive relationship with nature. Algorithms and AI are not simply flows of information in a dematerialized clouds. At least that's not how we see it. This system and these systems to work require a vast material infrastructure, billions of connected devices, servers, data centers, optic fiber, communication towers, electric energy, etc. So we document the ecological and energy footprints of algorithmic capital as an extractive industry. And we deconstruct the claim that AI applications will save us from climate disaster, for example. So we challenge that technological solutionism based on the actual energy and ecological weights of the technologies in a finite resource system like the Earth. So finally, the last three chapters of our book explore paths of reform, revolution, and exit strategies from algorithmic capitalism. And this is very important for us in our framework, as any critical theory must be oriented by an emancipation project. So it's a normative form of theorizing, right? In these chapters, we develop a virtue ethics approach to favor collective resistance and emancipation from algorithmic capitalism. We explore different scenarios of energy descent, of democratization of technological development, of potential good and just use of algorithmic technology and AI. We look at forms of individual and collective technological sobriety as well, which is an important concept in our work. So we evaluate as well the potentialities and limits of algorithmic economic planning. Could that work on a large scale? And finally, we present paths for a transition to a post-capitalist, techno-sober, just, democratic and ecological world. So since I cannot present all of these themes in depth, today, I choose to focus the rest of today's talk on the topic of labor. And since I'm speaking at the invitation of the School of Management and the emoLab, this might be a topic of interest for scholars and for managers as well. And this is one extremely important aspect of that new social order of algorithmic capital, the transformations and reconfigurations of labor. So let me perhaps synthesize here our findings, our positions on this topic. There are two distinct but related questions with regards to labor in algorithmic capitalism. The first question, the straightforward question is, and what happens to jobs? Right? So what happens to labor, to jobs in the sense of paid labor, employment? What is the impact of algorithmic technologies and AI on employment in different sectors? This question is very much debated and present in public and scholarly discussions. But in our view, and maybe that's our background as philosophers as well, but in our view, we're also faced with a broader question in algorithmic capitalism, which is, what is labor? If we understand labor not just as employment, but as productive activity, as human activity that produces our worlds. So if we adopt a more philosophic perspective on labor instead of a purely economic one, well, then we must rethink what labor is as well. What are these human activities of labor that produce the world in which we live? that produce the world of algorithmic capital are how our activities are related to capital in novel ways. So, so the first question, let's go to the first question. What is the impact on labor? And so what happens to jobs? So the current literature on the impact of AI on labor, and I'm sure you're familiar with these debates, is mostly organized around the topic of automation. And for very good reasons, obviously. And I should pause here to refer to the work of sociologist Aaron Bananev. And I have a little list of sources at the end. You'll find the source on the topic of automation, which is a super helpful book to get a clear, sober picture of developments in that regard. That being said, we have great debates and discussions on automation. And if you've consulted that literature a little bit, you'll see that you have forecasts that cover a wide spectrum between positions that, on the one hand, treat automation as mostly having no effect on jobs. So, it's mostly a rhetorical tactic to scare workers. It's a kind of photomation, as Astra Collar has called it, right? So you have that one end of the spectrum and two studies on the other end of the spectrum that predict as much as 50% of jobs that might become obsolete in the near future, and even more sometimes in some studies, right? We even see a new iteration of these age-old prophecies of the coming of leisure society. That these narratives have been with us since at least the 19th century. So, in our view, algorithmic automation does not signify the end of work. It does not signify the replacement of human work en masse by machines. And unfortunately, it does not lead at all to a leisure society for all. Very sorry to say. Neither are we exiting capitalism and entering a new techno-feudal era, as some critical economists have suggested. Rather, for us, automation generates trends of precarization, so rendering labor more precarious. I'm not sure precarization in English words, but in French we use précarisation, so making labor more precarious. It generates trends of fragmentation and intensification of work for humans as well, which do not sound like very positive developments for the working population. The one main thing automation seems to be doing across sectors is to reorganize productive tasks instead of just straight up replacing human labor. And a good example that we're witnessing at the moment is the rise of Gen AI, of generative AI, with algorithms such as ChatGPT, for example, which are reorganizing labor processes and practices in sectors of intellectual, administrative, artistic labor as well. But what we see with Gen AI is actually very much illustrative of algorithmic automation in other sectors as well, in my view. For the sake of simplicity, if you will, we can group these major impacts of automation on labor maybe under three main headings. First, an intensification of labor. So algorithms tend to intensify labor. And what I mean by that is that it's raising productivity standards associated with various tasks, which is, by the way, the historical function of technological innovation in the history of capitalism. And nothing new here. So we see an acceleration of labor time due to these rising standards of productivity. And productivity gains are, of course, very much sought after by employers, but they also occasion more intense labor time for employees, higher rates of exploitation from a critical theory perspective, as productivity gains do not necessarily mean higher wages for employees, right? So this is theorized as a higher rate of exploitation. A number of organizations thus automate partially or completely certain tasks, which can indeed lead to layoffs but more often lead to a reconfiguration of tasks associated with a given job. And it can create new tasks as well of supervision or management of AI programs, a director of digital transformation position, for example. Right? Second, we see new power relations configured and hierarchization processes as well in the workplace. In terms of power relations around labor, we can list a few things. The developers and owners of algorithmic technologies gain important power over all organizations, public and private, that implement these products and these operations, right? So we are operating with Microsoft software, right? So a few tech giants are to a large extent in a position to dictate labor norms, to dictate norms of productivity, standards for the rest of social organization. Additionally, new forms of surveillance and discipline are deployed by employers over employees or by tech itself over managers and administrators, creating new power relations in the workplace. We can also note new modes of hierarchization in the workforce in terms of tech literacy, in terms of work habits as well. And this is especially true for freelance workers. For example, those who have access to AI, know how to use it well, they can gain a comparative advantage over those who do not or cannot subscribe to the most performant versions of AI, which are often paid versions. They can gain a comparative advantage over low-tech working practices. And so people that still like to work with, pen and paper. So we see these new hierarchies develop. We see as well these new power relations develop in and around labor. Third, precarization of labor. And I apologize if I'm inventing an English word here, but there are two ways really to illustrate it. The first way to illustrate precarization is at the level of pressures put on some professions, which are actually made very clear if we consider the new generative AIs. So in this example, the data used in the training of Gen AIs comes from images, text, scrapped from the internet. These can be literary or visual art production, for example, which are used without any consideration for copyright. And we see important legal actions being initiated recently around these practices. Anyhow, in the case of image generating AI, like Stable Diffusion of Midjourney, for example, you have images generated containing non-retributed elements of an artist's work, which actually come back and precarize and return this very profession by offering a cheaper illustration generating process than actually hiring an artist, right? So that's the first way in which some professions can be precarized by algorithmic capital and algorithmic technologies. A second form of precarization is the rise of digital labor, and what we call in the literature the paradox of automation's last mile. So I keep this one for last, because notwithstanding the central importance of the other issues I've just reviewed, the rise of digital labor is probably the most spectacular development related to algorithmic capitalism. AI and algorithmic technologies necessitate and mobilize a very important digital labor force in the form of micro labor. Sometimes it's referred to as click work as well. In a nutshell, AI technologies require human labor inputs at various stages, from data generation to cleaning of data as well, to coding, to training of algorithms. This new type of labor is often invisibilized from the perspective of users of technologies, as we tend to see only this algorithmic interface, and we do not see the invisible human digital labor that supports the algorithmic interface. So there's a kind of what we call in the book a fetishism of algorithms, perpetuating this mythology of intelligent machines. But in fact, the automation of processes actually creates new tasks of click work that can only be taken on by human workers. A good example of that is, again, the development of ChatGPT by OpenAI. OpenAI hired a digital labor outsourcing firm called Sama to outsource some of the micro labor required in the training of ChatGPT. Sama went on to hire thousands of Kenyan digital workers in order to clean the data sets that were used in the training of ChatGPT. So these Kenyan workers, micro workers, click workers, they were paid less than $2 an hour to identify content in the data that was sexist, racist, homophobic, violent, traumatizing content like murder, war, child abuse, torture, rape, animal cruelty, etc., and clean the data sets of such content so that ChatGPT will not reproduce it. And ChatGPT, if you've tried it, remains fairly politically correct, polite, and nice in its answers to prompts. Right? Journalists later on went over to Kenya to interview the people that had participated in that digital labor project. And many of these workers declared that they were actually suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of them declared that they had suffered from depression as a result of that job, of being exposed, as you can imagine, day in, day out to traumatizing content. So this form of ghost work, as Gray and Surrey, the American sociologists, call it, is a vivid illustration of what is called in the literature the paradox of automation's last mile. The drive to eliminate human labor always generates new tasks for human. So the more you try to eliminate human labor, the more new tasks you create for humans. And these tasks are not fulfilling, and they do not favor the dignity of workers. They are often monotonous, alienating, and sometimes dangerous too, in the case I've just exposed. So ultimately, in light of recent developments, we seem to be moving away from a leisure society where difficult, dangerous, monotonous tasks would be automated. And us humans, we would get to do the fun, pleasing, creative, fulfilling tasks. Rather, we seem to be heading towards a society where AIs like ChatGPT and DALL-E automate writing, poetry, art, imagination, creative activities, social connection, and where humans are confined to the performance of difficult, dangerous, monotonous tasks in support of algorithmic machines, right? So it's a leisure society for robots and a precarious and hard work society for human workers. Beyond this overview of some of the impacts of AI on labor, there are broader questions raised by the transition to algorithmic capitalism, questions that have to do with the very meaning of human productive activities. And so we get to my second question earlier, the philosophical question: what is labor in our algorithmic worlds? Or in other words, what are these activities that produce the world of algorithmic capitalism? And in the book, we develop a concept of algorithmic labor to make sense or to organize in a kind of conceptual unity all of these different forms of productive activities that participate in producing the world today. We see algorithmic labor as the unity of four types of productive activities, or four types of human labor that produce the world today. The first type I've just talked about, digital labor. This category, though, encompasses more than just invisible micro labor. So it's more than just Amazon Mechanical Turk workers or other, crowdsourcing platforms. So you have click work in digital labor, but it encompasses also what we call on-demand labor. On-demand labor, think of labor performed on platforms, Uber drivers, rover dog walkers, handyman on handy, for example, right? So this is called on-demand labor as a form of digital labor. Digital labor also takes the form of what we call socially networked labor. And this is labor performed mostly for free by users of platforms of all kinds. You and I, for example, when we use Facebook or Instagram or X or whatever, we perform labor in several ways. We produce contents that garner attention time. We produce data, of course. We also annotate, organize data, right? When we use hashtags and all of these things. So digital labor can be paid. It can be badly paid and it can be unpaid as well. Right? And finally, in that category of digital labor, we also put what we call venture labor. So this concept refers to high-end digital labor performed by data scientists, app developers, AI scientists, etc., who are often employed by big tech corporations. So one thing to note about that broader category of digital labor is the formation of markets of such digital labor in complex international configurations. Here, the work of Phil Jones is very interesting and up to date on these issues. In the case of micro labor, for example, which is, as we saw with the example of SAMA workers, a precarious, unsafe, low wage type of work, we've now reached a point where the majority of requesters for digital labor, and so app developers, GAFAMs, are located in the global north. And the majority of micro laborers are located in the global south. So finally, on that topic of digital labor, I want to mention that what is probably the best book on the topic, after art, of course, but the best book on the topic, really, a book by Antonio Casilli, which in French is called En attendant les robots, is finally going to be translated in English and will appear in September by University of Chicago Press. So the English title, I believe, is Waiting for Robots. In my view, the best book on digital labor. So that's the first type or first moment of algorithmic labor, digital labor. A second one is what we call industrial or logistical labor. And here, think of all the labor that goes into the production, the assemblage of all the technological infrastructure, from phones to computers, to data centers, to connected devices, but also to stuff like electronic waste management facilities and so on. Think as well, not just of the productive work, but think as well how industrial production itself is now increasingly using algorithms and AI in all subsectors. Our industrial production and labor is now recharged, repowered in a way by the production of all sorts of connected goods. We put logistical labor in that category as well, such as Amazon employees working in warehouses, delivery trucks, they also enter into that category. The third type of activity we see is what we call extractive labor. So think of the labor producing the raw material, extracting natural resources and energy to build and power that technological infrastructure. Minerals, rare metals, electricity production, fossil fuels, and so on. Finally, one last but very important category in our framework is domestic labor. Domestic labor is defined as, so it can be material domestic labor, like cleaning, child rearing, cooking, etc. But there are also immaterial forms of domestic labor or productive activities, such as effective labor, forms of care work too, which are largely unpaid work performed historically and still today predominantly by women. These types of productive activity today are very much transforming under the influence of platforms, apps, connected objects, and smart home technologies. We dedicate a full chapter to these questions in which we mobilize social reproduction theory and some critical feminist theories of effective labor as well, to analyze the kind of colonization of social reproductive space-times with algorithmic technologies, with AI assistance, for example. And we show how these processes re-articulate the relation between domestic labor and capital. And more what we see is a domestic sphere connected to markets as a result. So for each of these, note that in these productive activities, we find paid labor, but also forms of unpaid labor, right? In digital labor, there are some forms of unpaid labor. In domestic labor, there's some forms of unpaid labor as well. So that's why we cannot just focus on paid labor for us. We have to have a broader concept of labor. So each of these four activities, they produce an element or an aspect of the algorithmic world in which we live. So digital labor produces algorithms, AI systems, and data. Industrial and logistical labor produces devices, material infrastructures, but data as well. Extractive labor produces energy, materials, and data. And domestic labor produces bodies, minds, labor power, and data as well. So this is an overview, if you will, of our two chapters on labor. This last chapter on domestic labor per se has been largely summarized and translated into English. It is published in the journal Spectre, which is a critical theory journal. So if you're interested, there's an English summary of that domestic labor chapter. We are at the moment in the last stages of discussions for a full translation of the book in English. And although I cannot make at this moment tonight any official announcement, I can tell you that we're confident that the book and our contribution towards a critical theory of AI will soon be available in English. So I end here with this slide, a selection of some sources among the amazing critical scholarly work that has inspired us. And this is just a small sample related to what I covered in today's presentation, but the bibliography in our book is 32 pages long. So we're building on a burgeoning and very important critical literature on the topic as well.